Under the pale light of a crescent moon, a battered jeep rattled down an unmarked road deep in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness. 4 friends, Ethan, Sarah, Lauren, and Jack, were en route to a remote camping spot Sarah had read about on a travel forum. The directions were vague but promised an unforgettable experience. They hadn't seen another car or sign of life for miles, only dense trees and winding dirt paths. The GPS was no help. It had given up an hour ago, displaying a mocking no signal across its dim screen. Ethan, behind the wheel, cursed softly as the road narrowed to barely more than a trail. "I think we missed a turn," he muttered. "Let's keep going a bit further," Sarah suggested. "The forum said the road looks bad but leads straight to the campsite." Lauren, sitting in the back, glanced out the window. Shadows played tricks on her eyes, the forest seeming alive, watching. "I don't like this," she whispered. "It feels wrong." Jack, ever the joker, leaned in with a flashlight under his chin. "Maybe it's the ghosts of all the people who missed the right turn." Nobody laughed. The Jeep hit a rut, jolting everyone. Ethan slammed the brakes. The headlights illuminated a crude wooden sign by the roadside. It was barely legible, the paint faded and chipped. "Raven Hollow, Tuma." "This has to be it," Sarah said, her voice wavering. "Raven Hollow doesn't sound very inviting," Lauren muttered. "We've come this far," Ethan said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Let's check it out. If it looks sketchy, we turn back." The Jeep crawled forward, the path twisting deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in, branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, a damp chill seeping into their bones. The headlights caught movement ahead. A deer, or so they thought at first. But it didn't move like a deer. It was quick, too quick, darting out of sight in a blur. "Did you see that?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "Probably just a raccoon," Jack said, but his tone lacked conviction. They emerged into a small clearing. The campsite was little more than a flattened patch of dirt surrounded by trees. In the center stood a rusted fire pit surrounded by moss-covered stones. "This isn't what I imagined," Sarah admitted. Ethan parked and they got out, stretching their stiff limbs. The night was deathly silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness. Lauren pointed her flashlight toward the trees. "What's that?" Carved into the trunks were strange symbols, crude and angular like warnings. Ethan brushed one with his fingers. Old carvings, probably nothing. But they all felt it. Something was off. They set up camp quickly, working in uneasy silence. Jack cracked a joke to lighten the mood, but it fell flat. They built a fire, its flickering light offering little comfort against the encroaching darkness. As they ate, they heard it, a low, guttural sound. It came from the trees, distant but unmistakable. "Coyote?" Ethan suggested, though he didn't believe it. "Let's not stick around to find out," Lauren said. Jack scoffed. "We're fine. Animals are more scared of us than we are of them." The sound came again, closer this time. Sarah stood abruptly. "I think we should go, now." Before anyone could respond, the fire sputtered, its flames dimming. Something moved in the shadows, tall, humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky, unnatural. "Oh my God!" Lauren gasped, backing away. The thing stepped into the firelight. Its face was a hollow void, blacker than the night around it. It let out a piercing screech, a sound that froze their blood. "Run!" Ethan shouted. They bolted for the Jeep, the creature close behind. Its footfalls were heavy, uneven, and terrifyingly fast. Sarah screamed as it reached for her, its bony fingers brushing her shoulder. Ethan fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. The Jeep roared to life, and they piled in, slamming the doors as the creature slammed against the vehicle, rocking it violently. "Go, go, go!" Jack yelled. Ethan floored it, the tires kicking up dirt. The creature chased them, keeping pace even as the Jeep sped down the narrow path. Branches clawed at the windows, and the road twisted endlessly, as if mocking their desperation to escape. Then the path opened up, and they found themselves on a main road. The creature stopped at the tree line, watching as they sped away. Hours later, they reached a small gas station. Shaking, they told the attendant what had happened. He looked at them grimly. "Raven Hollow?" he asked. They nodded. "You're lucky you got out. Most don't." The group never spoke of that night again. But in their dreams, they still heard the screech, felt the creature's void-like gaze, and they never took another unmarked road. The rain poured in relentless sheets, soaking the cracked asphalt of Highway 67. Taylor and Mason had been driving for hours, their destination a family cabin nestled deep in the Oregon wilderness. The storm had come out of nowhere, reducing visibility to mere feet. "We should have stayed at that motel," Taylor muttered, gripping the armrest as Mason squinted at the road. "We're close," Mason replied, though the unease in his voice betrayed him. The map said it's just a bit further, but the map didn't mention the turn they'd missed. As they pressed on, the highway transformed into a narrow, unlit road. The trees on either side loomed high and oppressive, their branches twisting like clawed hands. The GPS sputtered, flashing a garbled screen before shutting off entirely. "We should turn back," Taylor said, her voice cracking. Mason hesitated, then sighed. "Fine. Let me find a spot to turn around." The road was too narrow for a U-turn, so he drove on, searching for a clearing. That's when the headlights caught a small sign by the roadside. "Blackwood Trail, Scenic Route." "Let's try it," Mason suggested. "It's got to loop back to the highway." "I don't know." Taylor trailed off, her instincts screaming at her to refuse. But Mason had already taken the turn. The road quickly deteriorated, becoming a bumpy, uneven track riddled with potholes. It seemed to wind endlessly, leading them deeper into the forest. The rain had turned to mist, thick and choking, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Taylor asked, her voice tight. Mason didn't answer. He was staring ahead, jaw clenched. In the fog, shapes flickered. Trees, rocks, or something else. Something moving. The car jolted as the tires hit something solid. Mason cursed, bringing the vehicle to a stop. "What was that?" Taylor whispered. Mason grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. "Stay here. I'll check." "No, don't." Taylor started, but he was already out the door. The rain had stopped, but the forest was eerily silent. No insects, no rustling leaves. Mason swept the beam of his flashlight over the road, finding nothing at first. Then he saw it, a trail of something dark and wet leading into the trees. He turned back to the car, about to tell Taylor to lock the doors, when he noticed something. The forest behind the car wasn't empty. Shapes, tall, thin, and motionless, stood among the trees. "Mason!" Taylor screamed, and he turned to see a pale face pressed against her window, its eyes empty sockets and its mouth stretched impossibly wide. He ran to the car, but the door wouldn't open. The figure disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. "Get in! Get in!" Taylor sobbed, unlocking the door. Mason scrambled inside, locking the doors behind him. They didn't speak, only stared out the windows, breathing hard. The car was surrounded. Shadowy figures circled them, moving unnaturally, limbs jerking like marionettes. "Drive," Taylor whispered. Mason didn't need to be told twice. He slammed on the gas, the car fishtailing before speeding down the narrow road. The figures pursued, keeping pace with impossible speed, their distorted faces flickering in and out of view in the rearview mirror. The road seemed endless. No matter how far they drove, the figures remained, their hollow eyes fixed on the car. Then, just as abruptly as they'd appeared, they were gone. The road opened up into a clearing. Mason stopped the car, heart pounding, and they sat in silence, trying to catch their breath. "Where are we?" Taylor asked, her voice trembling. Mason didn't answer. He was staring ahead at the same sign they'd seen earlier. "Blackwood Trail, Scenic Route." It didn't make sense. They had driven in a straight line, yet they were back where they started. "No," Taylor whispered, tears streaming down her face. Mason turned the car around, determined to leave, but the road seemed different now. The trees were closer, their twisted branches reaching down like grasping fingers. Then they heard it, a low guttural sound like laughter coming from the woods. "We're not alone," Taylor said, clutching Mason's arm. The laughter grew louder, closer, until it seemed to surround the car, and then the headlights flickered, plunging them into darkness. A hand slammed against the windshield, pale and clawed, followed by another. The car rocked violently as dozens of hands clawed at the windows, the roof, the doors. The laughter turned into a deafening cacophony, drowning out their screams. The last thing Mason saw before the glass shattered was a face, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. The car was found weeks later, abandoned and covered in deep gouges. No sign of Mason or Taylor was ever discovered, though locals whispered about Blackwood Trail and the things that lurked there, waiting for the next wrong turn. The moon hung low in the sky, a pale, cold eye watching as Jenna and her two college friends, Eric and Paige, navigated their way through the back roads of northern Maine. They had been on a scenic road trip, hoping to escape the monotony of campus life. But as the sun set, the GPS lost signal, and they found themselves hopelessly lost. "Take the next left," Paige said, peering at a crumpled paper map she dug out of the glove compartment. "That doesn't look like a road," Eric said, slowing the car. The turn wasn't marked by a sign, just a break in the trees, where two muddy tire tracks cut into the dense forest. "It's a shortcut," Paige insisted. "This'll get us back to Route 5 faster." Jenna, in the passenger seat, stared at the dark path. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be found. "Maybe we should just turn around and head back the way we came." Eric hesitated, but finally sighed. "If it gets us out of here faster." The car bumped along the rough track, the forest closing in around them. The headlights barely penetrated the thick wall of trees, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Minutes turned into an hour, and the path only seemed to lead them deeper into the woods. "Are you sure this is a road?" Eric asked, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Paige looked at the map again, frowning. "It has to be, but I don't know anymore." Jenna leaned forward, squinting into the darkness. "Wait, stop! Look up there." In the distance, something reflective caught the light, an old road sign, barely visible through the overgrowth. Eric slowed the car as they approached. The sign was battered and rusted, its paint peeling. It read, Pine Hollow, population. The last number had been scratched out, replaced with deep gouges, as if something sharp had torn through it. "Let's turn around," Jenna said firmly. Eric nodded, but as he shifted into reverse, the engine sputtered and died. "Are you kidding me?" Paige groaned. Eric turned the key again, but the engine refused to start. "It's dead," he said, panic creeping into his voice. Jenna reached for her phone, but it showed no signal. "Great, now what? Let's just walk," Paige suggested, grabbing a flashlight from the glove box. "There's got to be someone around, a house, a gas station, something." "I don't think that's a good idea," Jenna said, but Paige was already out of the car. "Staying here won't fix anything." Reluctantly, Eric and Jenna followed, their flashlights cutting thin beams through the oppressive darkness. The air was heavy, damp, and silent. Too silent. No wind, no animals, not even the rustle of leaves. As they walked, the path began to change. The dirt underfoot turned to cracked, uneven pavement, and the trees thinned, revealing the skeletal remains of a town. The buildings were decrepit, their windows shattered, walls covered in creeping ivy. A single streetlight flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows. "Pine Hollow?" Paige whispered. "Maybe we can find help," Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. The three of them approached what looked like an old diner. Its sign dangled precariously, creaking in the still air. Jenna pushed open the door, which groaned loudly on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint smell of decay. Tables were overturned, and a thick layer of dust coated everything. But it was the walls that drew their attention. They were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all of people standing in front of the diner, smiling. Some were old, black and white, others looked recent. "That's weird," Paige said, her voice shaking. Eric stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating a photo in the center. His blood ran cold. "That's us." Jenna and Paige rushed over. There they were, smiling awkwardly in front of the diner. The photo was dated today. "No, that's not possible," Jenna stammered, backing away. A sudden noise echoed through the diner, a scraping sound, like nails on metal. "Run," Eric shouted, bolting for the door. They burst outside, but the town had changed. The buildings loomed taller, their windows glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light. The path they'd come from was gone, replaced by more twisted streets. "We're trapped," Paige whispered. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. They were human-like, but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their faces stretched into grotesque mockeries of smiles, and their eyes glowed faintly, like embers. One of them held a camera. "Run!" Jenna screamed. They sprinted through the maze of streets, the creatures following, their distorted laughter echoing all around. No matter which way they turned, the streets led them back to the diner. Finally, they stumbled into the clearing where the car had died. But it wasn't there anymore, just an empty road leading to nowhere. The creatures surrounded them, their smiles growing wider, impossibly wide. The last thing Jenna saw was the flash of the camera. Weeks later, a hiker found their abandoned car. Doors open, engine untouched. Inside was a photograph of three smiling friends standing in front of an old diner. No one ever found Pine Hollow, or them, again. The sun was sinking fast, casting long shadows over the desolate stretch of Route 316. Carla, Marcus, and Ben were heading back from a weekend hike in the mountains when Ben, the driver, decided to take a shortcut through the back roads to save time. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to dirt. Towering pines loomed on either side, their spindly branches forming an oppressive canopy. The forest seemed alive, whispering secrets to itself. "This doesn't feel right," Carla said from the back seat, her voice tense. "We're fine," Ben replied. "GPS says we'll hit the main road in about 20 minutes. GPS also said there'd be a gas station 2 miles back," Marcus grumbled, checking his phone. The screen read, "No service." They rounded a bend and came upon an old wooden sign hanging crookedly from a post. It read, "Welcome to Stillwood." Beneath it, someone had scrawled in red paint, "Turn back now." Ben laughed nervously. "Real welcoming place." "We're not stopping here," Carla said firmly. "Don't plan to," Ben replied. But as they drove deeper into the forest, the road narrowed and a dense fog began to creep in, swallowing the trees. The car's headlights barely cut through it. "Shouldn't we have seen houses by now?" Marcus asked. Ben didn't answer. The air inside the car grew heavy, the silence oppressive. Then up ahead, they saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Ben slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. "What the hell?" Carla whispered, clutching the seat. The figure didn't move. It was tall and thin, wearing a tattered coat that hung loosely from its frame. Its head was tilted unnaturally to one side, as though its neck were broken. "Let's just back up," Marcus said, his voice shaking. Before Ben could shift into reverse, the figure slowly raised an arm, pointing down the road. "Nope. Nope. Nope," Carla muttered, her breathing quickening. Ben hesitated. "Maybe it's just someone messing with us? Or maybe it's a trap," Marcus snapped. Ben edged the car forward cautiously. As they passed the figure, its head turned to follow them, its blank eyes catching the faint glow of the headlights. "I hate this," Carla whispered, curling into herself. The road twisted and turned, the fog growing thicker. Every so often, they caught glimpses of movement in the trees. A shadow here, a flicker of motion there. They came upon another sign, this one nailed to a tree. "No escape." "This is a joke, right?" Marcus asked, though his voice betrayed his fear. The car suddenly jerked to a stop. "What happened?" Carla asked. Ben cursed, stepping out to check. The tires had sunk into the mud, the car hopelessly stuck. "We'll have to push it," Ben said, trying to mask his growing panic. As he and Marcus stepped out, Carla stayed in the car, scanning the foggy woods nervously. That's when she saw it, movement in the rearview mirror. "Guys," she called out, her voice trembling. Ben and Marcus turned to look, and their flashlights caught the reflection of dozens of eyes watching from the trees. "Get in the car," Ben shouted. Before they could move, the figures emerged from the fog, tall, gaunt, and wrong. Their limbs were elongated, their mouths stretched into wide, unnatural grins. One of them reached out, its hands spider-like, and gripped the side of the car. Carla screamed as it pressed its face against the window, its empty sockets where eyes should have been. Ben and Marcus scrambled back inside, slamming the doors. "Drive!" Carla yelled. "The car's stuck!" Ben shouted back. The figures began surrounding the vehicle, their heads tilting in unison as they stared at the terrified group inside. One of them dragged a clawed finger across the windshield, the screeching sound piercing the silence. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, emitting a low, distorted voice. "You shouldn't have come." The headlights flickered, and the fog thickened until they could barely see each other. Then, the laughter started. Low and guttural at first, it grew louder, more menacing, until it seemed to come from everywhere. The windows shattered, and the figures poured in like a flood. Carla, Ben, and Marcus screamed, their voices swallowed by the fog. The car was found days later, abandoned on a pristine stretch of Route 316. There were no signs of the passengers, though deep gouges covered the vehicle, and the word Stillwood Fries was etched into the hood. No one ever found the town, and no map marked its location. Those who traveled that stretch of road after dark swore they heard laughter in the trees and saw shapes moving just beyond the headlights, but they never stopped to find out why. The old country road stretched out like a black ribbon under the night sky, the headlights of Carla and Tim's car piercing through the darkness as they sped home after visiting friends. Their usual route had been blocked off by roadwork, forcing them onto an unfamiliar road that twisted and turned through thick, shadowed woods. "Are you sure this will get us back to the highway?" Tim asked, glancing nervously out the window. Carla squinted at her phone. "The map says it loops back eventually." But even her voice wavered. They'd been driving for half an hour, and the road only seemed to lead them deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer to the roadside, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The night was silent, unnervingly so. No wind, no animals, just the hum of the car and the crunch of gravel beneath their wheels. Then, out of nowhere, a shadowy figure appeared in the middle of the road. Carla screamed as Tim slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just feet from the figure. They could see it now, a woman standing alone under the moonlight. She wore a white dress that looked torn and dirty, her long dark hair hanging in tangled strands over her face. Do you see her?" Carla whispered, her heart pounding. Tim nodded, swallowing hard. "Maybe she's hurt. We should check." Reluctantly, they got out of the car, keeping their distance. "Miss, are you all right?" Tim called out. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, head tilted slightly, as if listening. Then, slowly, she raised an arm and pointed down the road. "Maybe she's trying to guide us to the highway," Carla said, though every instinct screamed for her to get back in the car. Without another word, they got back in and slowly drove forward, passing the woman. Carla turned back, hoping to see her still standing there, but the road behind them was empty. The woman had vanished. They continued down the road, but something felt wrong. The trees grew even denser, and fog began to roll in, thick and suffocating. The headlights barely cut through it, and soon they were driving in a narrow tunnel of mist and shadow. "We should have turned around," Tim muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. Carla checked her phone again. No signal. "We're just going to have to keep going." Then up ahead, they saw it, another figure, standing still in the middle of the road. But this time, it wasn't the woman. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by shadows. He was pointing, too, his arm extended down the road as if to direct them. "This is getting too weird," Tim whispered. As they passed the man, he disappeared just like the woman. The road twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the foggy woods, and with every turn another figure appeared. Some were men, others women, some even children. All standing motionless, all pointing in the same direction. They lined the road like silent sentinels, their faces hidden in darkness. Each time they passed one, Carla felt an icy chill slide down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Finally, the fog thinned, and up ahead they saw a dim glow, a house, small and isolated, its lights flickering weakly through the mist. "Maybe we can ask for directions," Carla said, though dread filled her stomach. Tim parked the car in front of the house. The silence was thick, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. They approached the front door and knocked, the sound echoing into the night. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with hollow eyes and pale, wrinkled skin. She stared at them, unsmiling. "Can you help us?" Carla asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We're lost." The woman tilted her head, her gaze unnervingly blank. "Lost, you say? Many people get lost out here," she murmured, her voice raspy, "but not many come back." Tim shifted uncomfortably. "We just need to know how to get back to the highway." The woman's eyes flickered with something dark, almost amused. "The road only goes one way," she said. "If you want to find the way out, you'll have to keep following it. But be warned, the road takes its toll." Before they could respond, she closed the door with a loud bang. The couple returned to the car, each the ominous words lingering in the air. They sat in silence, too shaken to speak, and finally, Tim started the engine. As they drove away, the fog grew thicker and the figures reappeared. Only now, their faces were visible. Pale, expressionless, their eyes blank and unseeing. Each face was one they hadn't seen before, as though they were meeting new travelers lost in the mist. Then, Carla gasped. Ahead, standing still in the fog, were two figures, a man and a woman. The man looked like Tim, and the woman looked exactly like Carla. What is that?" Tim stammered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The two figures stared at them, their faces empty but hauntingly familiar. They raised their arms, pointing down the road. No, that can't be us," Carla whispered, her voice shaking. The car sped past the ghostly doppelgangers, and they vanished into the fog, just like the others. They drove faster, desperate to escape. But every turn seemed to bring them back to the same stretch of road, the same silent watchers pointing the way, as if urging them deeper into an endless loop. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell in the oppressive darkness. The road felt like it was swallowing them, twisting reality until time lost all meaning. Finally, they saw a faint glow ahead, but instead of relief, dread settled over them like a stone. It was the same house, its lights flickering weakly through the mist. Their hearts sank. They had come full circle. Desperate, they left the car and ran up to the house, pounding on the door. The elderly woman answered again, her hollow eyes glinting with dark amusement. "Back so soon?" she asked, a faint smile curling at the corner of her mouth. What's happening to us?" Tim pleaded. The woman chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "This road keeps what it claims. You'll find the way out eventually, one way or another." The door slammed shut, leaving them in silence. As they turned, they saw figures standing along the roadside again. But this time the faces were all too familiar. The woman in the torn white dress, the man with the shadowed face, each figure they'd passed along the way. They were all people, just like Carla and Tim, trapped in the fog. With a sinking realization, they understood the truth. No one ever left the road. The sky was ink black, the only light coming from the full moon that hung low over the horizon. Sarah, Daniel, and Ethan were heading home from a weekend cabin trip in the mountains when they missed a turn. The GPS recalculated and directed them to a side road, one that didn't look like it had seen traffic in years. "Do we trust it?" Sarah asked, leaning forward from the back seat. "It's either this or we backtrack for an hour," Daniel, the driver, replied. "Let's just get home," Ethan said, staring nervously out the window. "It's late." The car turned onto the narrow road, its headlights barely illuminating the dense forest pressing in from both sides. The deeper they drove, the rougher the road became. Gravel turned to dirt and then to uneven patches of cracked asphalt, overgrown with weeds. "This feels off," Sarah muttered. "We're fine," Daniel said, though his grip on the wheel tightened. Minutes turned into an hour, and the road showed no sign of leading anywhere. The GPS froze, then shut off entirely. Ethan's phone had no signal. "That's it," Sarah said. "We need to turn around." "I'll turn around at the next clearing," Daniel said, his voice tense. But the clearing came sooner than they expected. The forest abruptly opened up to reveal a cluster of old buildings. Their wooden frames was weathered and rotting. A rusted sign creaked in the breeze, its faded letters barely legible. "Burton Grove." "What is this place?" Sarah whispered. "It's not on the map," Ethan said, checking his phone again. Daniel slowed the car. "Let's just turn around here and go back." As the car began to reverse, the headlights swept over one of the buildings, a church with a sagging steeple. For a brief moment, they saw a figure standing in the doorway. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "See what?" Ethan asked, though his wide eyes betrayed that he'd seen it too. Daniel stopped the car. The figure was gone. "Nope," he said. "We're out of here." He shifted the car into gear and pressed the gas, but the tires spun uselessly in the dirt. "Are you kidding me?" Daniel muttered, stepping out to inspect. The ground beneath the car had turned soft, almost like mud, though it hadn't rained in days. "We'll have to push it," he said. Sarah and Ethan reluctantly stepped out. The air was thick and heavy, the silence pressing in around them. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness. As they worked to free the car, a sound broke the silence, a distant, echoing laugh. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her heart pounding. "Probably an animal," Daniel said, though his voice lacked conviction. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and crunching on gravel. "Get in the car!" Ethan shouted. They scrambled back inside, locking the doors. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything. Daniel tried the engine again. This time, it started, and the car lurched forward. Relief washed over them as they sped out of Burton Grove, the ghostly town quickly disappearing behind them. But the road didn't lead them out of the forest. Instead, it twisted and turned, looping back on itself until they found themselves back at the clearing. "That's impossible," Sarah said, her voice cracking. No, Daniel muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. The town looked different this time. The buildings seemed newer, less decayed, and lights glowed faintly in the windows. "We're not stopping," Ethan said. Daniel hit the gas, but the car barely moved, as if something was holding it back. Then, one by one, the lights in the buildings began to flicker on. Shadows appeared in the windows, figures watching them silently. From the church doorway, the figure they'd seen earlier stepped out into the clearing. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by a shadow, but as it moved closer they could see its features, or the lack of them. Its face was smooth, featureless, and its head tilted unnaturally like it was studying them. The figure raised an arm and pointed at the car. "Go!" Sarah screamed. The car roared to life, and Daniel pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The tires screeched as they sped out of the clearing, leaving the figure behind. But the road had changed. It was no longer a winding dirt path, but a narrow cobblestone street lined with lampposts. The forest was gone, replaced by tall, blackened buildings that seemed to stretch into the sky. "This isn't real," Ethan said, clutching his head. The cobblestone gave way to gravel, then to sand. The car came to a grinding halt. Ahead of them was a massive gate, its iron bars twisted into grotesque shapes. Beyond it was a void, an endless expanse of darkness. The laughter returned, louder this time, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The gate creaked open and the headlights flickered. Figures emerged from the shadows surrounding the car. Their faces were blank, their movements slow and deliberate. One of them reached the driver's side window and leaned in, its hand pressed against the glass, leaving behind a bloody smear. "What do you want?" Daniel screamed. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head and smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched across its entire face. The last thing they heard before the headlights went out was the creaking of the gate and the sound of footsteps closing in. When rescue crews found the car days later, it was empty, parked on a pristine stretch of highway. No one could explain how it got there, or why the words Burton Grove were etched into the hood in deep, jagged letters. The air was heavy with the promise of rain as Mark, Jenna, and Claire drove down an unfamiliar back road in the middle of nowhere. They had spent the day hiking, and now the three friends were desperate to make it home before the storm hit. "GPS says this road cuts through and saves us an hour," Mark said, his knuckles tight on the steering wheel. Jenna leaned forward, her eyes narrowing at the map on her phone. "If it's even accurate out here, this place isn't even on Google Maps." "It's fine," Claire said from the back seat. "What's the worst that could happen? We're just cutting through some small-town woods." The road narrowed, and the trees grew closer, their gnarled branches arching overhead. Soon the asphalt turned to dirt, and the crunch of gravel filled the silence. The car's headlights sliced through the encroaching darkness, revealing glimpses of tangled undergrowth and the occasional reflective flash of animal eyes. It was Mark who spotted the sign first, a weathered wooden plank nailed to a tree. "Hollow Pines. Pop, 54. "See," Claire said. "A town. Maybe they have a gas station. Or maybe they've never seen outsiders before," Jenna muttered. They laughed nervously, though the joke didn't quite land. The road twisted and turned before finally opening up into a small clearing. Hollow Pines wasn't much, a few houses, a general store, and a church with a crooked steeple. All of it looked abandoned, but not decayed. "Creepy," Jenna muttered. Mark parked the car in front of the general store. The windows were grimy, and the wooden sign above the door creaked in the breeze. "Let's see if anyone's home." Claire stayed in the car as Mark and Jenna ventured inside. The bell above the door jingled, startling them. Inside, the store smelled of dust and rot. The shelves were lined with items that looked decades old, faded cans of soup, jars of preserves, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. "Hello?" Mark called out. No answer. Jenna moved to the counter where an old ledger sat open. She leaned closer to read the faded ink. The entries were strange. 04/12/1987, John Sims taken. 07/05/1987, Mary Greer taken. 20/1987, Hannah Ward taken. "What the hell does that mean?" Jenna whispered. Before Mark could respond, the bell above the door jingled again. They spun around, expecting Claire, but the door was empty, swinging gently as though pushed by an unseen hand. "Let's get out of here," Jenna said, her voice shaking. They hurried back to the car, only to find Claire staring out the windshield, her face pale. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, climbing into the driver's seat. "Look," Claire whispered, pointing to the road ahead. Figures stood at the edge of the clearing. At first, it was hard to make them out in the dim light, but as the headlights illuminated them, it became clear. They weren't moving. They just stood there, silent and still, staring at the car. There were dozens of them, all dressed in old-fashioned clothes that looked like they belonged in a black and white photograph. "Go," Jenna urged. Mark didn't need convincing. He slammed the car into reverse then spun it around to head back the way they came. The figures didn't move, but their eyes followed the car, glinting unnaturally in the darkness. The road seemed different now. Where it had been a narrow dirt path, it was now overgrown with vines and thick underbrush. The trees loomed closer, their branches scratching at the car's sides like claws. "This can't be the same road," Mark muttered, his hands trembling on the wheel. "It has to be," Claire said. "We didn't turn anywhere." The headlights flickered, and for a moment they were plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the road had changed again. It wasn't dirt anymore. It was cobblestone, slick and black, and the forest had given way to a series of crumbling stone walls. "What is happening?" Jenna cried, gripping the edge of her seat. They rounded a corner, and the car skidded to a stop. A massive wooden gate stood in the middle of the road, flanked by stone pillars. The gate creaked open slowly, revealing more figures standing just beyond it. These figures were different. They weren't silent or still. They moved jerkily, their heads twitching at unnatural angles, their mouths hanging open as if in a silent scream. "No," Mark whispered. "We're not going in there." But the car wouldn't reverse. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them in eerie silence. The figures began to approach, their movements uneven and unnatural. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, and their mouths stretched impossibly wide. "Out of the car!" Mark yelled. They scrambled out, running back the way they had come. But the road behind them was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of fog. One by one, the figures emerged from the mist surrounding them. They formed a perfect circle, their heads tilting in unison as they stared. "What do you want?" Claire screamed. The figures didn't answer. Instead, they parted, revealing a single figure at the center, a tall, shadowy form with glowing red eyes. It raised a hand, and the world seemed to twist around them. The ground shifted, the trees bent unnaturally, and the air filled with a deafening hum. The last thing they heard was a low, guttural voice echoing through the fog. "Shh! Welcome to Hollow Pines. You belong to us now." Their car was found weeks later, rusting in the middle of the forest. There was no sign of the three friends, but deep scratches covered the hood, and the words "taken" were etched into the windshield. It was supposed to be a shortcut, a quiet rural road that wound through rolling hills and patches of forest. Mia and her brother Jake had taken it to save time on their drive to visit their grandparents, who lived miles away in a sleepy, secluded town. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a murky shade of purple. "Are you sure this was a good idea?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with unease. Jake shrugged, keeping his eyes on the narrow road. "The GPS says it's faster. Besides, we're almost there." But as the minutes ticked by, the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. The trees grew taller, their branches arching over the road like the bars of a cage. "Look at this place," Mia muttered, peering out the window. "It's like a forest swallowed the whole road." The pavement beneath their car gradually gave way to gravel, then dirt. The GPS lost signal. Jake frowned at the screen, tapping it uselessly. "No service," he muttered. "Great," Mia said, crossing her arms. "Now we're lost." The headlights carved through the encroaching darkness, illuminating little more than the trees ahead. Then the forest broke, and they saw a sign on the side of the road. It was old and splintered, the paint faded but legible. "Welcome to Black Hollow." "I've never heard of Black Hollow," Mia said, her stomach twisting. "Probably just a tiny town," Jake replied, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The road led them into a clearing where a cluster of buildings stood in eerie silence. It looked like a ghost town. The windows were boarded up, the paint peeling off the walls, weeds grew through the cracked pavement, and the air was unnervingly still. "Should we turn around?" Mia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake hesitated. "Let's see if there's someone here who can give us directions." They parked in front of what looked like an old general store. The wooden door creaked loudly as they pushed it open. Inside, the shelves were empty, and the air smelled of mildew and rot. "Hello?" Jake called out. His voice echoed back at them. Mia wandered to the counter, where a bell sat, tarnisty. She hesitated before pressing it. The chime rang out sharply, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from somewhere in the back. "Maybe we should leave," Mia said, stepping back. Before Jake could answer, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes. His clothes were old-fashioned, like something out of the early 1900s. "You're not from around here," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "No. We're just passing through," Jake said quickly. "We got turned around and were wondering if you could point us back to the main highway." The man tilted his head, studying them with an unsettling intensity. "There's no highway near here," he said. Mia's heart sank. "But the GPS doesn't work out here," the man interrupted. His lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You'll have to keep driving. The road'll take you somewhere eventually." Something about his tone made her shiver. They thanked him and hurried back to the car. As Jake started the engine, Mia glanced back at the store. The man was standing in the doorway, watching them leave. The road out of Black Hollow felt longer than it should have. The forest seemed darker, the trees taller, and the air heavier. An unnatural fog began to roll in, swallowing the headlights. "This doesn't feel right," Mia said, gripping the seat. Jake didn't respond. He was focused on the road, or what little of it he could see. Then, without warning, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Jake slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. The figure was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress. Her hair was matted, and her face was pale and gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. "Is she hurt?" Mia whispered. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring at them. Jake honked the horn, but the woman didn't flinch. Slowly, she raised an arm and pointed into the forest. "No," Mia said firmly. "We're not following her." Jake agreed, reversing the car to turn around. But as they drove back, the road twisted in ways it hadn't before, leading them right back to where the woman stood. "She's not real," Jake said, gripping the wheel tighter. "It's a trick or something." The woman pointed again, her expression unchanged. With no other option, they drove past her, following the direction she indicated. The road grew worse, the dirt giving way to jagged rocks. The forest was unnaturally silent, and the fog thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Then they saw it, a house at the end of the road, its windows glowing faintly in the fog. "This can't be happening," Mia said. "We don't have a choice," Jake said, pulling up to the house. They stepped out of the car, the silence deafening. The front door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark interior. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice echoing. The air inside was cold, and the walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper. The furniture was old and dusty, and the whole place smelled of decay. Then the door slammed shut behind them. Mia screamed, spinning around, but the door wouldn't budge. From upstairs came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heading toward the staircase. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, pulling at the door. The footsteps grew louder, and then they stopped. At the top of the stairs stood the woman in the white dress. She smiled. The lights flickered, and everything went dark. When the police found the car days later, it was abandoned on the edge of a forest. The doors were locked, the keys still in the ignition, and the seats covered in a thin layer of dust. There was no sign of Mia or Jake, but written on the windshield in streaks of mud were 3 words: "Welcome to Black Hollow." The rain fell in heavy sheets, drenching the narrow road as Emily and her boyfriend Luke drove through the unfamiliar countryside. They were on their way back from a weekend getaway, but the storm had turned their relaxing trip into a tense crawl through darkness. "This road feels wrong," Emily said, her voice barely audible over the pounding rain. Luke glanced at her, his jaw set. "It's just the weather. The GPS says we're on track." But as the minutes dragged on, the road became less familiar. The pavement was cracked and uneven, and the trees on either side grew closer, their twisted branches almost meeting above them. "Are we even still on a main road?" Emily asked, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. Luke didn't answer, his focus on navigating the slick surface. The GPS screen froze, then went black. Emily's phone lost service. "Great," she muttered, scrolling through the useless app. "Now what?" "We keep going," Luke said, though his voice lacked confidence. "This has to lead somewhere." Ahead, the headlights illuminated a sign. It was old and crooked, with faded letters spelling out Ashcroft Hills. "What is this place?" Emily asked, the name unfamiliar. "Probably some small town," Luke replied. "We'll find a gas station or something." As they continued, the trees gave way to a cluster of buildings, their shapes barely visible through the rain. The town was eerily quiet, the streets empty. Most of the buildings looked abandoned, their windows boarded up or shattered. Luke parked in front of what looked like a diner. The neon sign above the door flickered weakly. "Open." I don't like this, Emily said, her voice shaking. It's just a storm, Luke replied. Let's see if anyone's inside. The bell above the diner door jingled as they stepped in. The air was heavy, smelling of grease and mildew. The room was dimly lit, with a single flickering bulb casting long shadows over the cracked vinyl booths. Hello? Luke called out. No one answered. This place is giving me the creeps, Emily whispered. She turned toward the counter where an old menu was propped up. The items listed were strange. Boiled crow, $5.50. Bone soup, $3.25. Blood pudding, $4.75. Is this a joke? Emily asked, her stomach twisting. Luke didn't respond. He was staring at the far end of the diner, where a figure sat in a booth. It was a man, his back to them. His shoulders were hunched, and he was completely still. Excuse me? Luke said, taking a cautious step forward. The man didn't move. Let's go, Emily urged, grabbing Luke's arm. But before they could turn, the man spoke. His voice was low and rasping as though he hadn't used it in years. You shouldn't be here. Luke froze. We're just passing through. Do you know how to get back to the main road? The man's head tilted slightly, but he didn't turn around. There is no way back. Not tonight. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly raised a hand, pointing toward the window. They turned to look. Outside, figures were emerging from the rain. At first, they were indistinct, shadows moving through the downpour. But as they came closer, the headlights of the car illuminated their faces, or what was left of them. Their skin was pale and decayed, their eyes hollow sockets that oozed darkness. Some were missing limbs, others had twisted, unnatural bodies. What the hell is that? Emily whispered, her voice shaking. They come when the storm calls them, the man said. Luke grabbed Emily's hand. We're leaving. As they turned to run, the man finally moved. His head twisted unnaturally to face them, revealing a face that was wrong. His eyes were too large, his mouth stretched far too wide in a grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. You can't leave, he said. You're part of it now. They bolted out of the diner, the rain soaking them instantly. Luke fumbled with the car keys, but the engine wouldn't start. The figures were closer now, their movements slow but deliberate. Start the car! Emily screamed. Luke tried again, and the engine roared to life. The tires spun on the wet pavement before the car lurched forward. They sped through the town, the headlights cutting through the rain, but no matter how far they drove, the buildings didn't end. It was as if the town went on forever, looping endlessly. We're trapped, Emily said, her voice breaking. No, we'll find a way out, Luke insisted, though his hands trembled on the wheel. Suddenly, the car skidded to a stop. In the middle of the road stood a figure, a woman in a tattered white dress, her face obscured by a veil of wet hair. Luke honked the horn, but the woman didn't move. Go around her, Emily urged. But as they tried, the woman raised her head. Her face was skeletal, her eyes glowing faintly. She opened her mouth, and an unearthly scream filled the air. The windows of the car shattered, and the world seemed to tilt. When Emily and Luke woke up, they were back in their car, parked in the middle of the forest. There was no sign of the town, the rain, or the figures. But etched into the hood of their car were the words, Ashcroft Hills, you'll be back. Neither of them ever spoke of that night again. But sometimes when the rain fell heavy and the wind howled, Emily swore she could hear that same unearthly scream echoing in the distance. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the winding mountain road. Sarah, Dylan, and Matt were driving back from a weekend camping trip, their laughter fading as the GPS directed them onto a lonely, unpaved road. This doesn't seem right, Sarah said from the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the dense forest outside. It's a shortcut, Matt said, gripping the wheel. Saves us an hour. Dylan, lounging in the back seat, snorted. Shortcut to what? A horror movie? The road twisted and narrowed, the forest closing in around them. The trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches clawing at the night sky. The headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires echoed in the oppressive silence. Okay, this is creepy, Sarah admitted. Are you sure we're going the right way? Matt didn't answer immediately. He was too focused on keeping the car steady on the uneven road. Then he frowned, tapping the GPS screen. It says we're still on track, but the screen flickered, then froze. No signal, Dylan said, holding up his phone. Great. Classic. They continued in silence, the tension in the car growing with each passing mile. Then, out of nowhere, a sign appeared on the side of the road. Welcome to Barrow's Edge. Barrow's Edge? Sarah repeated, her voice trembling. That wasn't on the map. Probably some tiny mountain town, Matt said, though his grip on the wheel tightened. As they drove into the town, unease settled over them. The streets were deserted, the buildings old and crumbling. Dim, flickering lanterns hung from rusty poles, casting long shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. Does anyone even live here? Dylan asked, leaning forward to peer out the window. The car slowed as they approached the center of town, where a massive oak tree stood, its roots sprawling across the cracked pavement. Hanging from the branches were dozens of small, crude dolls made of sticks and twine, swaying gently in the breeze. That's not normal, Sarah whispered. Let's just keep going, Matt said, his voice tight. As they passed the tree, the car's headlights illuminated a figure standing in the shadows. It was a man dressed in tattered overalls, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge the car. He just stood there, staring. Did you see that? Dylan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, Matt said. I saw. They drove on, the road twisting out of the town and back into the forest. The air grew colder, and a dense fog began to roll in, obscuring their view. Then the car sputtered. Don't do this, Matt muttered, gripping the wheel. The engine died, and the car coasted to a stop. You've got to be kidding me, Sarah said, her voice rising. Matt tried the ignition, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Great, Dylan said, throwing up his hands. Now what? They sat in silence, the forest pressing in around them. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the town. Someone's coming, Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. In the fog, they saw a shadowy figure moving toward them. It was the man in the hat. Lock the doors, Matt said, his voice shaking. The figure stopped a few feet from the car, standing just outside the reach of the headlights. What does he want? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The man raised a hand, pointing at the forest. Nope, 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 Dylan muttered, sliding lower in his seat. Should we ask for help? Matt said, though he didn't sound convinced. Are you insane? Sarah hissed. The man didn't move. He just kept pointing. Then from the forest came a sound. It was low and guttural, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the air. What was that? Dylan asked, his voice barely audible. The sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't one thing, it was many. Footsteps, whispers, the snapping of branches, and then they saw them. Figures emerged from the trees, dozens of them, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes dark voids. Drive! Sarah screamed. I'm trying! Matt yelled, frantically turning the key. The engine roared to life, and the car lurched forward, narrowly missing the man in the hat. They sped down the road, the figures disappearing into the fog behind them. But the relief was short-lived. The road didn't lead them out of the forest. Instead, it looped back around, bringing them to the town square once again. No, Sarah whispered. This can't be happening. The dolls hanging from the tree were gone. In their place were crude wooden signs, each with a name carved into it. Their names. Matt slammed on the brakes, staring in disbelief. What is this? Dylan yelled. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder now, coming from all directions. The man in the hat stepped out from the shadows once more, joined by the pale, empty-eyed figures. The last thing they heard was a deep, raspy voice that seemed to echo from the very earth beneath them. You shouldn't have come here. Now, you never leave. When the car was found days later, it was empty, parked in the center of Barrow's Edge. The dolls had returned to the tree, but this time they bore an unsettling resemblance to Sarah, Dylan, and Matt. The town was abandoned, just as it had always been, or so the locals said.